Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 1st of August 2022. The articles which we are going to take up have been displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion.
The first news which we have taken up deals with money laundering. There is one editorial on page number 6, PMLA or Prevention of Money Laundering Act verdict, an erosion of constitutional buffers. And not my money, says Partha on cash recovered by ED or Enforcement Directorate. Money laundering has come into news in last 1 month because of arrest of a lot of high profile people from various locations across the country under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Money laundering, or the process of conversion of dirty money into the clean money, is a grave cause of concern for all the countries across the globe. Now, if you look at the UPSC syllabus under GS paper 3, money laundering and its prevention has been given as a part of your syllabus under internal security. Because first and foremost, money laundering is generated more often than not from illicit or illegal acts. For example, drug trafficking, arms smuggling, criminal activities like extortion money, and so all these things together have direct impact on India's internal security, and the way these money laundering and the proceeds of money laundering is utilized then again become a cause for concern, because a person obtaining his or her wealth or revenue from illicit sources ultimately is going to focus upon them, and so more often than not money laundering becomes the base for terrorist financing and organized crime networks. And that is why it is very, very important for us to understand what money laundering is, what are the processes and means to conduct money laundering, what are its impact, and what are the challenges. Now, there is one very important aspect which we will not take up today, which deals with the Act or the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, because it has been taken up already in the DNS. As far as previous year questions are concerned, in 2013 UPSC had asked, money laundering poses a serious security threat to a country's economic sovereignty. What is its significance for India, and what steps are required to be taken to control this menace? Then in 2018, UPSC had asked, India's proximity to two of the world's biggest illicit opium growing states has enhanced her internal security concerns. Explain the linkages between drug trafficking and other illicit activities such as gun running, money laundering and human trafficking. What countermeasures should be taken to prevent the same? So let us now begin the discussion. Starting with what actually is money laundering. So money laundering is a process that criminals use in an attempt to hide the illegal source of their income. What they basically do is that they pass their illegally obtained asset and money through complex transfers and transactions, or through a series of businesses, and in that process the money is cleaned. So the black money is made as an input, and what you have as an output is clean money, which can then be utilized just like all other clean money without any government restrictions or regulations. The word laundering comes from infamous gangster Al Capone's practice of using a chain of laundromats he owned to launder huge amounts of cash, and from there the word or the term money laundering has been derived. So as far as what is concerned, we understand it is a process of converting dirty money or money derived from illegitimate sources into clean source of money on which no objection can be raised from the government. And to give you an example, let's say there is a person A who earns a lot of money, crores and crores of rupees from, let's say, drug trafficking. Now the obvious problem is that this person A cannot deposit this amount into his or her bank account, simply because the income tax department and the government is going to ask questions as to what is the source of the money, and the person A will not be able to explain this source of money. And so instead of directly depositing this amount into the bank, what this person A can do is that it can parallelly run a hotel of, let's say, 10 rooms, out of which on an average 3 to 4 rooms are occupied and 6 other rooms are left vacant in general. So The average revenue which this hotel is generating every day is just from 4 rooms and 6 rooms are unoccupied. So this person A can divert this illegitimate cash and show to the government that all the 10 rooms were occupied throughout the year, and so the dirty money is mixed with the clean money, and now the revenue from the hotel can be easily deposited in the bank account as a form of revenue from a hotel which is a legitimate source, and then it becomes a white money. So you can see that through this process, person A was able to convert the illegitimate source of money into clean money, which then can be utilized for any purpose, because now under the system, under the government radar, it is accounted as a money from the hotel or profits from the hotel business, but actually 60% of that revenue has come from illegitimate sources. So this is a very simplistic idea as to how money laundering works. So why is money laundering done? Money laundering is done for two reasons. Either the source of income is illegal or illegitimate, for example drug trafficking and various other criminal activities. But does money laundering is used by only criminals or not other people? Of course it is used by other people as well, because even if their source of income is not illegitimate, for example professionals, it could be doctors, builders, it could be businessmen, all those people who have the source of income as legitimate, but because of the high taxes or because their unwillingness to pay the taxes to the government, they do not show their full income and rather divert these incomes derived from the legitimate sources and adopt a very complex financial procedure to evade taxes. So these are the two cases where money laundering is often resorted to. Now the obvious question is how the money laundering is done, and from the perspective of civil services examination, it is important to have a brief idea about the three stages adopted in money laundering, and they are known as initial placement, then layering, and then final integration. Now in order to better understand these three steps, let us take this example through a diagram. The first step, placement, which we just discussed, is about collection of the dirty money. It is the riskiest step where launderers insert the money into formal financial channel, because after all banks are required to report large transactions and these are huge piles of cash, and as we understood that first it will be placed, just like the example we talked about earlier. It was all about inserting that black money into hotel revenue, making it look like it is a legitimate source of money. Then the second step is layering, which involves sending the money through various financial transactions to change its form and make it difficult to trace. So for example, bank to bank transfer, international transactions, investment into shell companies, donation to political parties, sending it to the accounts offshore, purchasing high value items. All these things are done in the second layer just to make it extremely difficult for the law enforcement agencies, for the income tax department to trace back the original source of money. And then finally integration. Money re-enters the system and now it appears to come from legitimate sources, which is then most often than not involved in purchasing of luxury assets, property, creating trusts and receive donations through it in the future. Now there are various means to achieve money laundering. You must have heard terms like shell companies, hawala transactions, round tripping. So what does these terms actually mean? So now we understand that any kind of black money initially cannot be moved through institutional banking channels. It's impossible. You have to first place them, layer them, and then finally once it is integrated, that it can move through formal banking system without any threat. But before that, all that cash has to be moved, and that process in India is called as hawala transactions, where funds are moved between individuals, for example A to B, from one city to another, without actually physically transferring cash from place A to place B. So for example, if I have a lot of black money in Mumbai, I contact the Havaldar, that's why the name Hawala, in Mumbai, give him 1 crore rupees, and let's say if I transfer the money to Delhi, within next 5 minutes, person A is going to call person B, who is the Havaldar of Delhi, and that person is going to distribute exactly same amount in Delhi in next 5 minutes, very less amount of charge. So you can understand that this process is extremely convenient. Not only this transaction has evaded the scrutiny of the government, it has also saved a lot of tax, and it was done in 5 minutes for amount which was massive, and these amounts which Havaldar's deals can go up to thousands of crores. There is no physical transaction of cash between A and B, because when the cash is being transferred from Mumbai to Delhi, similarly there will be another person who would want to transfer the cash from Delhi to Mumbai. And so this process is extremely convenient. Then bulk cash smuggling, just like drug smuggling, carrying the huge piles of cash, which is what is caught during the times of elections in cars, in other kinds of vehicles. Then the process is round tripping, which is worth understanding, where the money leaves the country through various channels such as inflated invoices, payments to shell companies overseas, or even Hawala route internationally. Then that money is invested in shell companies and other assets in foreign country, and then those assets come to India, those money come back to India as an investment from those shell companies into India's share market, and this is what is known as round tripping. So black money goes to a shell company in, let's say, Cayman Island, which is a tax haven. Now that Cayman Island company is going to invest into various companies in India, making it look like a foreign investment, but actually it is an illegitimate money obtained from operations in India. Then of course gambling, no need for me to explain. And then finally shell companies, which are businesses that have large amounts of financing but are not directly involved in any specific business enterprise selling goods or services, and that's why the name shell. They just have paperwork, they do not have any real functioning or operation, and these finances are used to invest in other businesses which are typically legitimate. Now of course money laundering has proven to be a menace for the society, economy, and there have to be proper reasons, because once illicitly earned money enters into a particular economy's financial system, it has the ability to destabilize the economic system and indirectly promote negative social and legal ills such as tax evasion, which basically means loss of revenue to the government. So as far as primary impact of money laundering on economy is concerned, tax evasion, loss of revenue to the government are the two directly we can think of. But then there are legal impacts of money laundering as well. For example, money laundering and criminal activities form a vicious cycle. The quest to legalize illicitly earned money leads to money laundering, which in turn provides the required financial boost or the initial capital for further illegal activities, as well as it incentivizes a lot of people to take up violence, to take up crime, because they have seen other people getting filthy rich as a result of money laundering. And so it threatens law and order of that particular city, country, or state. Then it has, of course, social impact as well, because money laundering is directly associated with high level of drug addiction in that particular society, because there is a lot of wealth which is unaccounted for. And so more often than not, that wealth is utilized in drug addiction, and then it leads to declining law abidance, because law abiding citizens lose the incentive, lose the motive to follow the law, because they see that all those people who are breaking the law are enjoying their lives while they are making their lives miserable by following the law. So this is a big problem. So since legal provisions related to Prevention of Money Laundering Act has already been covered, we are going to take up the challenges because of which the governments across the globe are trying to fight and control the money laundering, but they are not very effective. And one of the biggest reasons behind that is rapid advancements in digital technology. The enforcement agencies are not able to match up the speed with which the digital technology and digital financing is enabling the money launderers to obscure the origin and proceeds of crime, and especially by utilizing the cyber finance techniques. Then another important reason because of which it is becoming an increasing challenge is non-fulfillment of the purpose of Know Your Customer norms or KYC norms. Increasing competition in the market is forcing the banks to lower their guards and thus facilitate the money launderers to make illicit use of the banking transactions and channels in the process of money laundering. Because after all, banks also need businesses, they need rich, wealthy clients, and in that process, if they feel that this transaction is going to yield them some benefit, they'll lower their guards, providing an avenue for money laundering. Then the tax haven countries. They have long been associated with money laundering because their strict financial secrecy laws allows the creation of anonymous accounts while prohibiting the disclosure of financial information. And of course, last but not the least is lack of awareness about seriousness of crimes of money laundering. The poor and illiterate people, instead of going through lengthy paperwork transaction in banks, prefer the Hawala system where there are fewer formalities, no or little documentation and lower rates and of course anonymity. The next article which we have taken is a very important one because it directly finds a place in GS paper 2 syllabus under international institutions. And there have been questions in the previous years with respect to World Bank, IMF, WHO, and so a question on WTO can well be asked. Now, why is it in news? India has been seeking relief from WTO in terms of its public stock holding of food. So basically, we provide minimum support prices to farmers. And the reason why we provide it is twofold. One is, of course, to provide income security to the farmers, to ensure the financial viability of the agriculture, and at the same time we want to have enough grains to provide it under NFSA or targeted PDS. However, under WTO law, such price support based procurement from farmers is counted as a trade distorting subsidy, a form of government intervention that is not allowed under WTO regime. And currently India has got a temporary relief due to a peace clause which bars countries from bringing legal challenge against such price-based support systems across the globe. However, a permanent solution to this issue is still not in the offing. Now, when a question in the mains examination is going to come, it is going to come on the overall dimensions covering WTO with respect to the overall challenges which is facing, what are its advantages, disadvantages, and so that is what we are going to cover rather than just keeping ourselves focused on agreement on agriculture, which of course will become a part of the discussion. Now, why is it important for civil services examination? Now, if you have seen the syllabus of GS paper 2, you must have seen an important line. Important international institutions, agencies and fora, their structure, mandate. And so in this regard, not just for the prelims examination, obviously this is important for that, but from the perspective of mains examination, there are few things which are very important. And so in this regard, we will start by first understanding why is there a need for such an international organization. Why in the backdrop of World War II, a need was felt for that GATT was created and then finally WTO took it from there. So we'll understand the basics of WTO, its advantages, and then finally we will look into the challenges currently being faced by WTO. Now starting with the basics, because most of our viewers are quite new and for them it is very important to understand how and why it was created. So before WTO there existed a GATT or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It more or less functioned on the same lines, which was created in 1948 to regulate world trade. And it was created as a means to boost economic recovery after Second World War by reducing and eliminating trade tariffs, quotas and subsidies. So during the Great Depression, a breakdown of international relations and an increase in trade regulation made poor economic condition even worse, and it contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. And just as the war finished, allies believed that a multilateral framework for the world trade would loosen the protectionist policies that defined 1930s. Now, what are the protectionist policies and what are these tariffs and quotas and subsidies? So these are a way to carry out protectionism, which is a practice of following protectionist state policy, which allows for the government of a country to promote its own domestic producers, service providers, and thereby boost their domestic production of goods and services. For example, let's say if there is a government contract, and if Government of India mandates that only Indian companies can bid for that contract, that is a kind of protectionism. Similarly, let's say that Government of India puts a limit on how much cars can be imported, let's say 100 per year, that is a quota. Similarly, Government of India can impose, let's say 100% import duty on a lot of products, and that is tariff. Or in other ways, the Government of India can provide domestic producer of cars 50% rebate in, let's say, iron and steel. And so that is a subsidy. And so all these kinds of measures are called protectionist policies. So the taxes or duties imposed on imports are known as tariffs, restriction on the volume of import are known as quotas, and negative taxes or tax credits are known as subsidies. So these are the three main ways of providing protection. And let us understand them by an image which you can see on your screen. So these are tariffs. Then government provides subsidies which allows producers to lower the price of local goods and services because they are getting benefits from the government. Then you impose quotas. And then no matter how low a fee sets the price through subsidies, it cannot ship more goods because there is a limit on how much you can import. And even if that good is very cheap, you cannot import more than that. And then finally, you tweak with the currency, deliberate attempt by a country to lower its currency value, which would make its exports cheaper and more competitive. So in the build-up of World War II, most developed countries across the world increasingly resorted to these four methods, and because of which the global trade was suffering, because protectionism has its own fair share of disadvantages. Of course, it offers more growth opportunity, lower imports, more jobs and higher GDP for the local population or for the residents of the country. But in the longer term, it is not good for any economy. Why? Because first and foremost, it leads to stagnation of technological advancement. As domestic producers don't need to worry about foreign competition, they have no incentive to innovate or spend resources on R&D of new products. Similarly, there is very limited choice for consumers. If you ask your parents about the choices they had about electronics goods or even cars, they would tell you that they were not available because consumers have access to fewer goods in a market as a result of limitations on how much foreign goods can be imported because of protectionist policies. There is increase in prices due to lack of competition. Consumers will need to pay more without seeing any significant improvement in the product. And since there are very less number of choices, consumer has to choose what is available. And finally, it leads to economic isolation. Because there are high tariffs, there are quotas, and there are subsidies given to local markets and local producers, that country or that economy becomes to grow increasingly distant from other economies, and so the exchange of ideas is minimum, and which leads to not just economic but also political and cultural isolation. Just try to think of North Korea when you talk about protectionism. It's just not economically isolated but also culturally and politically. And so that is why a need was felt to create an organization which would counter protectionism, would liberalize trade by reducing tariffs and removing quotas among member countries. This will not just counter protectionism but increase in global trade, which would then boost the war-ravaged economy of World War II scenario. And so in this context, GATT was thought of. Ultimately, it was taken over by WTO later on, but this is the context in which WTO works. So far, we have understood why it is important to have a global institution working towards a global trade or a rule-based trading system. So some important aspects of WTO is that it was established in 1995, or rather it took over or changed its form from GATT to WTO, and it is a successor of that, and it deals just not with goods, which was the main emphasis of GATT, but it deals with services, intellectual property, dispute settlement, as well as trade monitoring. An important aspect is that it is not a specialized agency of United Nations, although it has an arrangement with the United Nations through which it maintains strong relation with United Nations. So this is a very important information. And so WTO functions for smooth, free and predictable global trade, or for the creation of free trade, which is a policy that means governments do not charge people to import or bring in goods from other countries or make exporter pay taxes to send their goods abroad. Because you need to understand that when companies invest in other countries, they want the trading rules to not change suddenly in their disadvantage. And for that, they need protection. And so that framework is provided by WTO. And so it is important for us to understand and appreciate the advantages which are derived from WTO. So first and foremost is that it talks about a gradual reduction of tariffs. As you can clearly see the example of United States on your screen. On your y-axis we have tariffs as a percentage of imports, and on x-axis you have years. And if you start looking from 1940, you can clearly see a gradual reduction in the import duties imposed by United States. And similar is the case with other countries as well. And so it talks about gradual reduction of tariffs, and through which it wants to promote free trade. Then it acts as a legal framework, not just for negotiation of countries or among them, but also for other kinds of trade barriers as well. Then it enables trade without any discrimination, and it is not like that WTO is just a body vouching for free trade or completely free trade, which means no tariffs, no barriers, no quotas, nothing. It allows for tariffs and trade restrictions under certain conditions. For example, if a country A feels that a country B is exporting very cheap raw material which is artificially deflated, then the country A can impose duties without violating WTO rules. Similarly, there are clauses such as national security which a country can utilize to impose significant barriers to trade for a specific country. And then finally, all these rules are to protect fair competition because there are rules which member countries have to abide by. Whether it is about subsidies or contracts or import or export, once you become a member of WTO, your national rules have to align by the general framework. And so that is how the disadvantages of protectionism are countered. It leads to lower prices for consumers because then imports become cheaper. It promotes fair trade because then foreign companies can function in any of the countries which are member and can expect a fair treatment from the government. Then it leads to specialization because when all companies are treated equally, then the companies can produce a product anywhere across the world. And that location is mainly decided by the factor of manufacturing cost and not other policies like quotas and tariffs and other barriers. And finally, it leads to the development of economies of scale. Because by encouraging free trade, firms can specialize and produce higher quantity. This enables even more economies of scale, which is important for industries, especially in the current context. And the success of WTO is demonstrated by the raw data. WTO has over 160 members representing 98% of world trade. There has been an increase in the trade dispute which have been brought to WTO, showing that WTO indeed has become a forum to help resolve these disputes. Also, WTO regulations have helped avoid a major trade war. And finally, let's see the data. So on your screen, this graph shows world exports as a percentage of GDP. So on the y-axis, you have exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP, and on x-axis, you have timeline, and you can clearly see an increasing trend throughout. So this clearly shows increasing global trade in last 50 years since the time a global rule-based order was established in global trade. Despite all its advantages, there are some issues, and they are significant ones. There are a lot of areas where WTO has been severely criticized. On one hand, it is true that it has led to counter-protectionism, but on the other hand, it is also true that it has given rise to inequalities, not just in terms of wealth, but also in terms of industrial and other kinds of development. Let us understand how. So first and foremost criticism of WTO is that it is unfavorable to developing nations because it is derived from GATT, which was established in the context of World War II, and all the victors and the global north came together to frame a rule which was very beneficial to them. For example, let's take the case of tariff protection. This is the way which was resorted to by developed countries during the time of Industrial Revolution. They utilized heavy import duties to stop the import of goods from foreign countries. US did it to exclude Germany, Germany did it to exclude Britain, and each one of them did for each other. They utilized these tariff and quotas to grow their economy. And now once they are developed, they have access to technology, they have access to capital, and now they want developing countries to significantly reduce their tariff barriers. They want India to significantly reduce and continuously lower their import duties. And so we know that countries like India and other countries do not have industrial base. And at that point of time, if the import duty is significantly reduced, it leads to the import of cheaper products from foreign countries, and then which further deters the industrial growth. And the second reason why it is unfavorable to developing nations is the categorization of most favored nation by WTO. So under WTO agreement, countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. So for example, they cannot grant someone a special favor such as a lower custom duty or rate, and if you do it for one, you will have to do it for others as well. So what does that mean? That means that if India is providing special treatment to a third country A, it will have to provide the same treatment to company from USA, a company from China. And that is a problem because companies from USA and China are pretty strong, right? Negotiating at WTO or any of its meetings require a very high level of specialized and technical knowledge of not just the law, but also about nuances of trade and economy, which developing countries generally do not have. And since they do not have that kind of human resource which can negotiate on their behalf, more often than not, the agreements, especially for African countries, are designed against them. And of course, when it is unfavorable to developing countries, in more aspects, it is favorable to developing nations. Because the way negotiations have been designed or the way agreements work, they enable various kinds of protection. And these protections are applicable only for developed countries. Let's take the agreement on agriculture, which is the framework which governs the farm subsidies of WTO, which is the agreement of WTO which governs the farm subsidies. It has categorized the farm subsidies into trade distorting domestic subsidies and non-trade distorting subsidies. So all those subsidies which are trade distorting shall have to be eliminated, whereas all which are not trade distorting can go on. So all trade distorting subsidies are categorized under amber box, whereas non-trade distorting subsidies are categorized under blue and green boxes. And so under WTO, these are allowed. An interesting fact is that most developed nations provide their farmers with the kinds of subsidies which are categorized under this box, whereas the way India or the way other developing nations provide subsidies to their farmers have been categorized under trade distorting, and it is a pressure on them to put an end or at least reduce these subsidies, which of course is in favor of developed nations. Then recently, there has been a push for change in definition of developing country under the principle of special and differential treatment. So which talks about upgrading certain developing countries from the status of developing. And this is going to deeply impact not just India, but many other countries like China, Egypt, Turkey, as well as South Africa. And the reason behind this is that there is an assumption that these countries have benefited immensely from WTO rules since its formation in 1995. And there is also a belief that these countries have progressed enough that they should not be getting benefits of a developing country. And so that is also going to act in favor of developed nations. Then a very important and a good thing about WTO is that all decisions are made on consensus. There is no concept of voting, and unless and until all the members agree to a particular agreement, that shall not come into force. That is a good thing, but that itself has become the biggest roadblock in the progress of WTO. Since the members of WTO are clearly divided between developed, or you can say global north versus global south, there has been a lack of development on any of the major agreements in last 20 years. And there is a fragmentation among countries. So for example, developed countries want to push their agenda with respect to rules on e-commerce, investment, intellectual property rights. But exactly on these agenda, developing countries are quite reluctant. Similarly, developing countries want to push for reform of agreement on agriculture, which developed countries are not interested because they already are having a lot of benefits from that. Then there are other issues as well. For example, agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, or acronymed as TRIPS, which is an international legal agreement between all the member nations of WTO with respect to rules regarding protection of intellectual property rights. For example, protection of patents, copyrights, logos, and various other such creations for companies from one country into another. It establishes minimum standards for regulation by national governments of different forms of IP. And it has been mainly criticized by developing countries because of its discriminatory nature. Because it is discriminatory in nature. Why is it discriminatory? Because most of the intellectual properties are owned by countries which belong to developed world. And now they want to sell their products in developing countries but want their IPRs to be protected at the same level as they are protected in developed countries. And now this is leading to creation of artificial scarcity of products, which can be okay in some cases but cannot be good in various fields. For example, in medical fields, in pharmaceuticals. Let's take an example of a medicine. Let's say if India has weak IPR laws and if a company somehow manages to develop the same medicine which is being sold in America and it starts the manufacturing. That is not possible right now, but at least it is going to save a lot of lives. But with imposition of strict TRIPS laws, only company A, which originally manufactured that medicine, is allowed to sell products in the developing countries as well. Then the next issue arises from dispute resolution mechanism of WTO. Dispute settlement system, or DSS, is a mechanism to resolve trade dispute between and among member states. The members of DSS are also appointed by consensus. And so if one of the member blocks the appointment, it shall become dysfunctional, and it has become dysfunctional since 2019 because of a lot of trouble being created by United States, which has led to very low number of judges to produce rulings. There are just not enough judges to produce rulings, and it has led to a huge backlog of cases pending in DSS. And finally, when the countries grow very powerful, they start resorting to unilateral tariffs. If you are reading newspaper, you must have read that in past 2 to 3 years, how China and USA have unilaterally imposed various kinds of tariffs on each other products without paying heed to the rules and procedures of WTO. Similarly, in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, many countries including India have resorted to protectionism despite WTO in existence. So clearly you can understand that challenges in front of WTO are not small. There are mega challenges which the new Director General would have to face. So in this regard, in this discussion, we started by first understanding the context in which the parent body or the predecessor of WTO was formed, that is GATT. That context was extreme protectionism, to counter which a GATT was established, which then passed on the baton to WTO. Then we understood what advantages have been arrived, how it has worked in favor of increasing the global trade, but nonetheless it has its fair share of challenges and issues which needs to be resolved pretty soon. Let us now move on to the next discussion.
The technology powering hybrid electric vehicles appears on text and context page. The article talks about a new term in the automobile market which is called hybrid electric vehicle. So because of the increasing concern of environmental damages caused as a result of emissions, we have seen the emphasis and the focus on electric vehicles, which are completely powered by batteries and they run on electric motors. But hybrid electric vehicles are different from electric vehicles, simply because hybrid vehicle is the one that uses two types of power. It of course has internal combustion engine which runs on either diesel or petrol or natural gas, and then it also has an electric motor to power the vehicle, and depending upon which one of these two power is used, where is the balance, it is categorized into full hybrid, mild hybrid and a plug-in hybrid. Now from the point of view of prelims examination, this is a very important discussion. Also, it can be asked in the mains examination under the science and technology of GS paper 3. So commonly called hybrid electric vehicles or HEVs, a hybrid car is simply one that relies on two different power sources for motion. The two different power sources are typically petrol and electricity, or diesel or electricity. So either one of the burning fuel, and of course electricity has to be there. Now full hybrid can run on just the combustion engine, the electric engine, or a combination of them. For example, the Honda City HEV is an example of full hybrid.
A full hybrid is never plugged into recharge, so their batteries are not recharged by plugging them into a power source like electric vehicle Tesla. But the battery is recharged by running the combustion engine. So while the car is running, the battery is being charged as a result of that. Whereas a mild hybrid has an electric motor and a combustion engine which always work together. An example of this is Maruti Suzuki Vitara Brezza, which soon will be available in Indian markets. Mild hybrids cannot run on just electric or just combustion modes, they run on both the sources of power together. Whereas a plug-in hybrid usually have greater electric only ranges than full hybrids. Plug-in hybrids essentially serve as halfway point between full hybrid and fully electric vehicles. So although they have two sources of power, but they are used when the one power source has been exhausted. So for example, when you have run out of diesel, you can drive some miles on electric. Now a term regenerative braking has been used or is commonly used associated with hybrid electric vehicles or HEVs. So what is this regenerative braking and how does it work? So it is a mechanism found on most hybrid and full electric vehicles, and it captures the kinetic energy from braking of the vehicle and converts it into electric power that then charges the vehicle's electric batteries. So in a conventional braking system, a car slows down due to friction between the brake pads and rotors. But this system is highly inefficient when it comes to conserving energy. Nearly all of the kinetic energy propelling your car forward is lost as heat when you apply the brakes, and that's a lot of wasted energy. And so, regenerative braking solves this problem by recapturing around 70% of the kinetic energy that would have otherwise gone as a heat waste. The amount of energy recovered depends on your car model, of course, and the driving behavior. And so, how does this work? And so, in electric cars, the drivetrain is powered by a battery pack that powers a motor, creating a torque rotational force on the wheels. With regenerative braking, the energy from your spinning wheels is used to reverse the direction of electricity from the electric motors to the battery. All you have to do is remove your foot from the accelerator, or in some cases press the brake pedal to activate regenerative braking. The electric motor not only acts as an electric generator, but it also helps slow your car down because energy is consumed by the wheels as they rotate the shaft in the electric motor. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of regenerative braking? Brake pads and rotors may last for longer time. Extended range possibilities for EVs, because then in the process of running they will be charged, and better fuel efficiencies for, of course, hybrid vehicles, and that is why we are using them. But then there are minor, not very significant disadvantages of regenerative braking system as well, because they may be less effective at lower speeds, because in order to charge your batteries you need higher regenerative force, for which you need higher speeds. Brake pedal may feel different because integration of regenerative technology, and potentially it might have less stopping power. Less stopping power because when people start using the regenerative force for braking, they actually get less accustomed to the actual braking power, which then might result into unintended consequences. The next article which we have taken has appeared on text and context page. The need for a distinction between blasphemy and hate speech. And this article talks about section 153A and section 295A of the Indian Penal Code, or IPC. Now in this context, it is important for us to understand that from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination, blasphemy is not important. Although hate speech might be important, and that has been taken up in the DNS. And so right now we are going to keep ourselves limited to article 153A and 295A, which could be important from the perspective of prelims examination. Starting with section 153A, where the purpose is to punish persons who indulge in wanton vilification. Wanton means deliberate or unprovoked, and vilification means The act of speaking or writing about something in abusively disparaging or disrespecting manner. So deliberate disrespect or attacks upon religion, race, place of birth, residence, language of any particular group or class, or upon the founders and prophets of a religion. This is what section 153A directly talks about. Now, the jurisdiction of this section is widened so as to make promotion of disharmony, enmity, or feelings of hatred or ill will between different religious, racial, language, or regional groups or caste punishable. Offense on moral turpitude is also covered in this section. Wicked behavior or depraved activity in terms of moral values. The offense is a cognizable offense and the punishment for the same may extend to 3 years or with fine or with both. However, the punishment of the offense committed in a place of worship is enhanced up to 5 years. So what are the ingredients of section 153A? First and foremost, the act of promoting enmity between different groups on grounds of religion, race, place, birth, residence, language, caste, community, or any other group. Acts which are prejudicial to the maintenance of harmony between different groups or castes or communities, and acts causing fear or alarm or feeling of insecurity among the members of any religious, racial, language, or regional group or caste or community by use of criminal force or violence against them. Whereas section 295A is all about punishing deliberate and malicious acts intended to outrage the religious feeling of any class by insulting its religion or religious belief. So you can see that while section 153A was more focused towards inciting enmity, inciting mistrust between two communities, 295A is more about insulting one particular religion. And so this section only punishes an aggravated form of insult or vilification of a particular religion or religious characters when it is perpetrated with deliberate and malicious intention of outraging the religious feelings of a class. And so the ingredients of section 295A are: the accused must insult or attempt to insult the religion or religious beliefs of any class of citizens of India. The said insult must be with a deliberate and malicious intent of outraging the religious feelings of the said class of citizens. The said insult must be by words either spoken or written, by signs or by visible representation or otherwise. The offense under section 295A is cognizable and a non-bailable, and it is non-compoundable offense. Cognizable offense means that police has to take cognizance, has to acknowledge that act. Non-bailable means that the bail as a matter of right is denied and you have to go to the judiciary, request for a bail. And non-compoundable means that you cannot enter into an agreement or a compromise later on. For example, murder is a non-compoundable offense, which means if a accused wants to enter into an agreement or a compromise with the aggrieved party, it is not allowed. And the investigation as well as the trial will go independently because state has now become a party to that case. And so the police have power to arrest a person charged under section 295A without a warrant.